Recently, I agreed to go to a costume party, which I'm going as Gandalf the Grey, and I was asked to bring my own themed cup for beverages. So I thought it'd be fun and rather appropriate to bring a wooden cup that I made. So to start this build off, I'm gonna chop up a 5/8 by 1.5 inch piece of walnut into 8-inch sections. These will make up the 12 sides of my cup. Each of these 12 pieces need to be cut at 15 degrees, or as you can see on my digital angle finder here, 75 degrees. And I got that number by dividing 360 into how many sides I have, which is 12. So that 360 divided by 12 equals 30. And then you divide that number by 2, which gives me 15 degrees. Next, I'm setting up my dado stack to be 3/4 of an inch wide and 1/4 inch tall. Using my dado blade is not entirely necessary for these cuts I'm about to do. I could have just used the existing 10-inch blade that I already had set up, but getting the exact thickness of each cut dialed in so that all I have to do is one push right through the blade is gonna make it a lot easier. Now, whether I'm using a dado stack or just a regular 10-inch saw blade, I like using a stop block that every time I make a pass, I get a cut in the exact same place. Now that I've cut the grooves to accept the bottom piece that I'm about to cut out, I can temporarily assemble the cup, get out a pencil, trace the inside circumference onto a piece of oak that I had just lying around in my garage. And then I'm gonna use a compass to extend that line out 3/16 of an inch. Since the grooves that I made on the side pieces of the cup goes in 1/4 inch, that gives me a 1/16 inch of space all around the bottom piece. And now I can bring this piece to my bandsaw and get it cut out. I could also use a jigsaw, scroll saw, or a coping saw would work really well if you wanted to cut it out by hand. Well, the fit looks good. Before I glue this all up, I'm going to build a handle, and I'm gonna quickly cut that out on my bandsaw. Just like with the cup bottom, you don't have to use a bandsaw to make these curved cuts. At a minimum, you could just get away with using a coping saw. And now I'm going to sand it up just a little bit on my belt sander over here. This belt sander is pretty new to my shop, but I really like it, and I can't imagine ever going back to not having one of these. Also, as you can see, you can convert it into a spindle sander, and you can sand inside curves relatively easily. If you don't have a fancy tool like this, you can also just use a high grit sandpaper and sand the inside curves by hand. I'm also going to put a 1/8 inch roundover on the inside and outside of the handle before I do the final sand and then install it to one of the 12 pieces. If you don't have a router, you can always just use sandpaper and remove as much material off the edges as you want, and you could get pretty close to the same 1/8 inch roundover that I have done with my router. A quick sanding with 220 grit with my random orbital, and this will be ready to connect to the cup and take finish. Okay, now my handle's ready, and I can stick it onto one of these pieces. I've seen a lot of people connect the handle after the glue up of all the pieces, and that just seemed unnecessarily difficult, so I decided to connect it before the glue up. So for the handle, I'm going to use CA glue to just tack it down And then I'm going to reinforce it with some screws. And you might be thinking, why not use wood glue? Well, wood glue would be perfectly fine, but wood glue, I would need to clamp it down and let it dry for a bit. This is pretty immediate, and I can do the next step, which is put in screws. And whether I was using wood glue or CA glue, I would still be adding in some screws. So it really doesn't matter what type of glue I use, and CA glue overall is going to save me just a little bit more time. Getting the drill bit depth is important, which is why I added that little blue piece of tape. I'm also using a Craig jig drill bit, which is 3/8 of an inch wide, and sets me up perfectly for covering them with plugs. This plug cutter is perfect. Just stick it in any drill I've got and cut out a 3/8 inch tapered plug that makes it really easy to glue into a 3/8 inch hole. Once I have these in place, I'll let them dry for about an hour, and then I'll come back with my flush cut saw and cut off the excess. Often I'll cut off plugs with my bandsaw or even my table saw, but the most important thing when cutting off plugs is you just want to be really careful to not scar the surface. A little bit of marring is okay, because you can just sand that out with a random orbital, but you just don't want them to be too deep. Now it's time for the final glue up, and I'm going to remove the old tape and put new tape down vertically over each joint, which when I fold it all up will help keep an even pressure along each mitered edge while the glue dries. I thought about a bunch of different types of wood glues I could use for this project, but bottom line, it doesn't matter because I'm going to seal the inside with epoxy, an FDA approved food grade epoxy that will waterproof the inside of the cup, so the wood glue is never going to really come in contact with any beverage that I put in there, so any wood glue will do just fine. I've let this sit for an hour now, and the wood glue should be plenty dried. Here I'm just going to barely trim a tiny bit off the very top of the rim just to level it up perfectly, and then flip it over onto the other side and do the exact same thing with the bottom. I'm just barely going into the wood, but I want to get it a little bit more even than it was, and you can see a little bit of tooth mark right there, but now it's close enough that I can use my random orbital 220 grit and just get that ready for finish and epoxy. I'm using a 1/8 inch round over on the bottom edge of the cup, on the inside of the top edge of the cup, and then I don't actually show this in the video, but a 1/4 inch round over on the outside top edge of the cup. Here I'm cleaning up the dried glue squeeze out with a chisel. This is really not the best way. Hindsight is 20/20 in this case, and I wish I would have used a wet rag to remove the glue before it had dried. I'm gonna epoxy the inside of the cup to seal it up. I'm gonna have the epoxy go right up to this edge right here. And so wherever I don't want to get epoxy, I will be adding tape. This was a big consideration for me. I really wanted the inside of the cup to be sealed, and I wanted the outside of the cup to be natural wood. So should I put epoxy on the rim as well, where my lips are going to be touching, or not? I decided that overall the best thing to do would be having the epoxy on the rim, simply because it's more sanitary, easier to clean, and then that end grain isn't going to be soaking up moisture as easily. Applying the epoxy is pretty simple. I'm just using a foam brush. You could probably also use a chip brush, or any paint brush would work just fine. So I'm definitely going to be doing multiple coats. I can see on the end grain, air is wanting to get through it. So hopefully this layer is going to seal down that end grain really well. And then I'm going to come back in 2 hours and put another layer on. And each time I do this, I'm going to pull the tape because I don't want the tape to get glued down. I'm going to use less with this mixture. I'm going to do about half of what I did the first time. Maybe not. Maybe a little over half. The first coat of epoxy really wanted to soak into the wood, and therefore I just had to use more epoxy, that first coat. Versus the second one, I can use less. Oops. I just realized I forgot to tape this off real quick. So it's been about 2 hours since my first coat. This epoxy says you can reapply after 2 hours, and it's still tacky, so I'm going to be able to get a really good chemical bond. If it wasn't tacky, I would have to, and it was completely dried, use some sandpaper, scuff up the inside to get a mechanical bond. I'm just using a foam brush, and I'm just basically painting the inside, trying to not get it too thick. If it's too thick, I'm going to get drips. With this epoxy, I get about 20 minutes of working time, and I don't recommend going over those 20 minutes because then you risk the epoxy setting up, starting to harden up, and you might see brush marks. Usually I use a propane torch, but this actually works really well too. And all I'm doing is just moving it over the epoxy at a distance and popping bubbles so that this finish is nice and clear with no bubbles, especially at the top up here where you'll actually see the bubbles. Make sure to take the tape off so you don't glue it down. Now I'm just going to use a flush trim router bit to shave off just a little bit of my overflow on these edges. First I'm going to take some tape and get that on the top so that I can protect my top edge. This epoxy is fully dried, but it is not fully cured. Fully cured means it's been sitting for 4 to 5 days, and at that point it'll be rock hard, but at this point it's still fairly soft and can easily be scratched. Okay, that removed some of the bulk of it, and now I'm going to finish it up with a random orbital. And last but not least with this project, I need to put the finish on the outside of it. So the inside is all epoxied, and the edges are all cleaned up, and now I can just add a little bit of mineral oil, and that's going to be the finish on the outside. And mineral oil is food safe. It's a finish that I'm going to have to reapply more regularly, but I wanted the outside of this to be as natural wood feeling as possible. Otherwise, I would have just epoxied the whole thing. But really, the epoxy is just to seal the inside up and make it nice and easy to clean. I don't expect this cup to get a ton of use, but I'll probably use it a couple times a year, here and there. And each time I do, I'll probably add a little bit more mineral oil. Just a few times here and there. Maybe sand it back down occasionally. Yeah. Starting to look pretty good. I'm definitely never going to put this in the dishwasher. This is a hand wash only type of thing. Probably goes without saying. But the inside, since I epoxied it, is going to be very easy to wash. And there you have it. A fully functional wooden cup. Or maybe a better name for it is a tankard. But I'm going to put beer in it, wearing my Gandalf costume.